Scientists in Turkey might have just found evidence that proves Noah's Ark is real. They discovered a huge structure in eastern Turkey that matches the Ark's dimensions, plus traces of sea life and clay. Could this be the real Noah's Ark? This latest discovery might just be the proof we've all been waiting for. All that and more, these are ancient artifacts that may prove history's greatest myths. Scientists in Turkey just made a huge discovery that could actually prove Noah's Ark was real. For years, they've been looking at this giant structure in eastern Turkey called the Dura Formation, which some people think could be the location of the Ark. It's 530 feet long and matches the size the Bible describes for the Ark, and it's right near the Turkey-Iran border. Then, just last year, researchers deciphered an ancient Babylonian tablet at the British Museum. The tablet has a poem that talks about a man, probably maybe Noah, and his family landing an ark that was supposed to save life. It also talks about how the world was created, which got people thinking this could link to the Dura site. The latest discovery adds even more weight to the idea. Scientists took some rock and soil samples from the site and sent them to Istanbul for testing. The results came back with traces of clay, marine deposits, and tiny seafood bits like mollusks. If Noah really had the Ark, those little sea creatures would have been on board as well. The dating of the materials puts them around 3,500 to 5,000 years old, which does line up with when the flood in Genesis is said to have happened, around 3300 BCE. The team believes the area was once covered by water, which could be a sign of a big flood event. Now, even if you're still skeptical, at the very least, this research could be evidence that the Noah's Ark story did have at least some basis in reality. To what extent? That remains to be seen. In the mountains near Napulzi, South Africa, there's something really bizarre carved into a granite cliff, a giant footprint. It's about 4 feet long with 5 distinct toes, an arch, and even what looks like a heel. Some call it the footprint of God. It's so precise that it honestly just looks like someone stepped into the rock while it was still soft. Someone really, really big, mind you. That granite cliff is estimated to be over 200 million years old. That's dinosaur territory. Humans and even our distant ancestors weren't supposed to be anywhere near that timeline, so how do you explain this very human-looking footprint that size in rock this ancient? Scientists say it's just a natural formation that happens to look exactly like a footprint, but come on, really? That's the best explanation we have for this thing? Some just don't buy this, that it can be chalked up to erosion alone. So what then? Is this actually the footprint of some ancient giant? Well, if that's the case, it means it was walking around way before we thought humans ever existed. Of course, no one's claiming giants are 100% confirmed here, but this formation is pretty uncanny. For centuries, the city of Troy was considered nothing more than a good story, a myth cooked up by the Greeks to add some spice to their epic poetry. Homer's Iliad told of gods and heroes, a 10-year siege, a famous wooden horse, and a city that was supposedly wiped off the map. Most historians thought the whole thing was fictional until one eccentric treasure hunter decided to dig. In the 1870s, a German businessman turned amateur archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann traveled to a dusty hill in modern-day Turkey called Hisarlik. Locals didn't think much of it, it was just another pile of ruins, but Schliemann was convinced that this was the real Troy. Well, after some reckless digging, he literally blasted through layers with dynamite, he discovered stone walls, towers, gates, all these relics from a city that had been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. One layer, dating to around 1200 BCE, matched the time Homer's war supposedly happened. Among the rubble, Schliemann claimed to find a stash of gold jewelry. Priam's treasure, he called it, after the king of Troy. Whether or not the treasure was authentic is still up for debate, but the city itself, very real. And the deeper archaeologists dug, the more they found that lined up with Homer's account, including signs of a siege and a destruction by fire. So maybe the gods didn't hurl thunderbolts and Achilles didn't have a magical heel, but the war, the city, and the fall, that part might have been true all along. In Hindu mythology, the city of Dwarka is a place of miracles. Built by Lord Krishna, it was said to be a golden city that shimmered on the coastline, full of palaces, gardens, and impossible technology. According to legend, it was so advanced that it had flying machines and automated gates. The entire city supposedly sank beneath the ocean after Krishna's death. For centuries, it was written off as a spiritual allegory, not an actual place. Then came the divers. In the early 2000s, off the coast of Gujarat, marine archaeologists using sonar scans discovered something strange on the ocean floor. A massive grid-like pattern that looked suspiciously like something man-made. They ended up finding stone walls and paved roads spread over a large area, some dating back 9,000 years, older than Egypt's pyramids. They retrieved artifacts too, like pottery shards, stone anchors, and tools, all signs that there was this organized urban area that nobody thought would have existed that early in history. The mainstream scientific world hasn't fully agreed on whether this site is the Dwarka written about in myths, but a lot of Indian scholars believe that it is strong evidence that the legend wasn't just poetic metaphor and that it was based on a real city that got swallowed up by the sea. Story goes that deep beneath the palace of King Minos there was a twisting underground labyrinth built to hold a monster. The Minotaur, half man, half bull, who fed on unlucky prisoners. Every few years, Athens had to send a batch of young people to be tossed in as sacrifices. That's the myth, anyway. And for the longest time, people chalked it up to ancient Greek storytelling. Dramatic and brutal, but made up. But then archaeologists started digging in Knossos on the island of Crete, and what they found was kind of weird. Massive ruins of a palace complex that seemed almost designed to get lost in. Dozens of corridors, staircases that led nowhere, rooms that loop back on themselves, and storage chambers stacked deep underground. It wasn't a literal maze with high stone walls or anything like that, but it had the same confusing, winding structure. Even stranger, the Minoans, the civilization that built it, were obsessed with bulls. They carved bull heads into their art, painted murals of bull leaping ceremonies, and buried bull horns into their foundations. Some historians think that the Minotaur myth might have come from an outsider's twisted interpretation of these Minoan rituals. Throw in earthquakes and a sudden collapse of their society, and you've got all the ingredients for a legend to grow. So maybe there wasn't actually a Minotaur monster lurking around in here, but the palace, the maze, the eerie obsession with bulls, that's real, and this may have been the setting that the legend was based on. This one also comes straight out of the Bible, the book of John to be exact. Jesus heals a blind man by spitting in the dirt, making mud, smearing it on the guy's eyes, and then telling him to go wash it off in the pool of Siloam. Man does, and boom, he can see. For centuries, religious folks believed in the story, but most scholars treated it like a symbolic tale. The pool itself thought to be just a part of biblical folklore. Nice message, not a real place. Well, that changed in 2004, when city workers in Jerusalem were doing some basic repairs on a busted sewage pipe. And while digging, they hit stone steps, and not just a few. What they'd stumbled onto was the edge of this large ancient pool, complete with wide stone staircases leading down into the water. Archaeologists swarmed the site and confirmed it. This wasn't just any old reservoir. This was the pool of Siloam, exactly where the gospel said it would be. They found coins and pottery and other items buried in the mud, all dating back to the Second Temple period, right around the time Jesus would have been walking those streets. The whole layout matched historical texts, and it was clearly used by Jewish pilgrims for ritual cleansing before heading up to the temple. So yeah, they found the pool, and while no one's out here claiming they can prove the miracle, the place where it supposedly happened, that is real, and it sat buried under a modern city for nearly 2,000 years. For a long time, people argued that King David, the guy who took down Goliath with a rock and ruled over a united Israel, might not have been a real person. Some scholars thought he was more of a legendary figure, like King Arthur, inspiring, sure, but no solid evidence to prove he actually existed outside of religious texts. Then in 1993, something odd popped out of the dirt in northern Israel. At an ancient site called Tel Dan, archaeologists came across this broken slab of black basalt with writing carved into it. An inscription in Aramaic dating to the 9th century BCE. It had been repurposed as building material in a wall, which probably helped preserve it. When experts started translating the writing, one phrase jumped out: House of David. This was a huge deal. It was the first time David was mentioned outside of the Bible. It showed that not only did David likely exist, but that his lineage, his dynasty, was powerful and well known enough to be name dropped by his enemies. The stone seems to have been set up by a rival king, bragging about defeating both the king of Israel and someone from the house of David. This doesn't just back up the idea of a real King David, it gave us a glimpse into how feared and influential his bloodline was. For centuries, people treated the legend of the Amazon warrior women from Greek mythology like pure fantasy. Tall, fierce, battle-hardened women who lived in their own society and didn't take orders from any man. That had to be the stuff of legend, right? Well, no, it turns out the Greeks might have been describing a real group after all. Archaeologists have discovered a number of burial mounds called kurgans in the Eurasian steppes, particularly in southern Russia and Ukraine, and contain the remains of women buried with weapons, armor, and horses. Their bones showed signs of battle injuries, and some were buried in the exact same style as elite male warriors. The Scythians, a nomadic people who lived around 2,500 years ago, were known to the Greeks and might have been the real-life inspiration for the Amazon myths. In fact, nearly 1/3 of all Scythian warrior graves found in these areas belonged to women. If you've ever seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, which I surely hope you have, you probably remember Tanis as the city where the Ark of the Covenant was supposedly buried. In the movie, it's this mythical sand-swallowed place full of curses and lost treasures. But what most people don't realize is that Tanis was real, and what archaeologists found there was just as wild as the legend. Found in the Nile Delta, Tanis was an actual ancient Egyptian city, once the capital of the 21st and 22nd dynasties. For a long time, people thought it was just another pile of ruins. Nothing special really, but in the 1930s, French archaeologist Pierre Montet started digging and came across something incredible. Royal tombs that hadn't been touched by looters. That's almost unheard of in Egypt. Inside these tombs were solid silver coins, gold masks, and jewelry that rivaled what was found in Tut's tomb even. Montet even found inscriptions and relics that referenced powerful priest kings and mysterious religious practices. It was the kind of treasure haul that made people wonder if those old stories about lost cities full of sacred artifacts might have had some truth to them after all. Now, no, they didn't find the actual Ark of the Covenant in Tanis, but the fact that the city was real, lost for centuries, and hiding all these untouched treasures, that was pretty cool. So there's this ancient scroll that lists every ruler in history, kings, dynasties, battles, floods, but half of it reads like pure science fiction. It's called the Sumerian King List, a strange cuneiform tablet found by archaeologists in Iraq. Copies of it date back over 4,000 years. The list starts with kings who supposedly ruled for thousands of years. One guy, Alulim, was said to have reigned for 28,800 years. Then there's a line that says the flood swept over, which sounds an awful lot like the biblical flood. After that, the reign lengths suddenly become more reasonable, and the names start matching up with known historical figures. So what's going on here? Some scholars think that the early parts of the list were myths meant to make the rulers seem more godlike, but the artifact does kind of blur the line between legend and record. With all that said, I've been your host, James. I'll catch you, yes, you specifically, in the next video.